Did you know that the idea of knights on white horses, pining for distant, pure ladies, is mostly a myth? Have you ever stopped to think about what courtly love really meant in the Middle Ages, around the 11th to 13th centuries? Get ready to have your ideas about medieval romance completely flipped. We are about to unpack the top 10 big misunderstandings about courtly love you might have been carrying around. Number 10. It was universally accepted and praised. You might think that something so often portrayed as grand and romantic in stories would have been embraced by everyone in its time. The idea of a knight dedicating his life to a lady, performing brave deeds in her name or composing beautiful songs for her, seems pretty charming, right? But the truth about courtly love is far more complicated than a simple storybook picture. This elaborate system of idealized, often illicit affection was far from universally loved or even widely practiced in the medieval world. In fact, it faced strong vocal opposition from some of the most powerful institutions and thinkers of the era. Church, for instance, a central pillar of medieval society, viewed many aspects of courtly love with deep suspicion and open hostility. For religious authorities, this kind of love, especially when it involved married individuals, was a direct pathway to sin, a violation of sacred marriage vows, and a distraction from the devotion owed to God. Preachers and theologians frequently warned their congregations against the dangers of worldly affections and the temptations of the flesh categories into which courtly love often fell. Bernard of Clairvaux, a highly influential Cistercian abbot of the 12th century, for example, would certainly not have looked favorably upon the themes of earthly passion and potential adultery found in many courtly narratives. He was a champion of spiritual devotion and asceticism, and the pursuits of courtly lovers would have seemed frivolous, even corrupting in his eyes. Beyond the formal condemnation from religious institutions, moralists of the time also chimed in with their critiques. These were thinkers who believed in upholding a strict code of behavior and social order. They saw courtly love as a source of social instability, a potential disruptor of families, and a breeding ground for scandal. The very concept of a love that existed outside or even directly against the bounds of matrimony was seen as dangerous. It challenged the established hierarchy and the sanctity of marriage, which was considered a foundational element of Christian society. Think about the potential for feuds, ruined reputations, or even violence that could arise if a courtly affair became public, or if a jealous husband discovered a hidden relationship. These were very real concerns in a society where honor and lineage held immense weight. Even within the very literary traditions that produced courtly love, there were voices that mocked, satirized, or questioned its ideals. The Roman de la Rose, a hugely popular and influential French allegorical poem, started in the 13th century by Guillaume de Loris and later continued by Jean de Meun, offers a fascinating example of this internal critique. While the first part of the poem, written by Guillaume, beautifully explores the idealized pursuit of love and the Garden of Delights, Jean de Meun's much longer continuation takes a vastly different, far more cynical, and often misogynistic turn. Jean de Meun's section dissects and often ridicules the very notions of courtly love, exposing its potential for deception, its artificiality, and the self-serving motives of its participants. He challenges the romantic ideals presented earlier, presenting characters who are far less noble and more interested in personal gain or base desires. This shift in tone within such a pivotal work demonstrates that not all contemporary authors or audiences uncritically embraced the courtly love ethos. Some saw its flaws, its dangers, or even its absurdity. Thus, the idea that courtly love was a universally cherished concept in the Middle Ages is a misconception, as it was a subject of intense debate, condemnation, and even satire. Number 9. It was exclusively a male pursuit, with women as recipients. When you think of courtly love, chances are you picture a male knight, poet, or lord, tirelessly serving his lady, who remains a distant, perhaps passive object of his affection. The narrative usually centers around his devotion, his trials, and his attempts to win her favor. While it is true that many of the most famous examples of courtly love literature were written by men and depicted male lovers, it is a significant misconception to believe that women were merely silent muses or passive recipients in this complex cultural phenomenon. Women played incredibly active and vital roles, not only as the inspiring figures for these poetic expressions, but also as influential patrons, and even as authors themselves. One of the most prominent examples of a powerful female patron is Eleanor of Aquitaine. Living in the 12th century, Eleanor was one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in Western Europe. She was Queen of France, then Queen of England, and a highly cultured individual. Her court, particularly in Poitiers, became a vibrant center for the development of courtly culture and literature, including the songs of the troubadours. These troubadours, poets and composers from Occitania, southern France, traveled to her court and others, performing their intricate love songs known as cansos. Eleanor and her daughters, like Marie de Champagne, not only listened to these performances, but actively engaged with the themes, patronizing poets, discussing the nuances of love, and contributing to the very environment where courtly love flourished. They were not just passive audiences. They were discerning patrons who shaped the artistic output of their time. Perhaps even more strikingly, women themselves were poets of courtly love. These female troubadours were known as trobairitz. While their numbers were smaller than their male counterparts, their existence fundamentally challenges the idea that courtly love was a strictly male domain. Trobairitz composed their own cansos, expressing their own perspectives on love, desire, and the courtly relationship. One of the most famous trobairitz was the Comtesse de Die, active in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. Her extant poem, A Chanter mer de so quiu non volria, I must sing of that which I would rather not, is a powerful lament about a lover who has betrayed her, but it also expresses her own strong desire and the pain of unrequited or lost affection. Comtesse de Die's work shows a woman openly articulating her feelings, sometimes in terms that even reverse traditional gender roles, where she, the lady, is the one expressing intense longing for a less attentive knight. Her voice is not passive. It is direct, emotional, and assertive. Other trobairitz include Castellosa, who wrote poems of strong desire and frustration, and Almux de Castelnau and Isia de Capio, who engaged in a poetic debate about the nature of love and fidelity. These women were educated, aristocratic, and had the leisure and social standing to pursue poetic creation. Their poems often offer a fascinating counterpoint to male-authored works, sometimes challenging the patriarchal assumptions of the time or providing a glimpse into the female experience of courtly love. For example, some trobairitz poems criticize the infidelity of men, lament the constraints placed upon women, or even express explicit physical desire. They were not just the subjects of poetry, but also its creators, shaping the language and themes of courtly love from a woman's perspective. The literary contributions of these trobairitz, though fewer in number than the troubadours, demonstrate that women were active participants, expressing their desires, frustrations, and insights, rather than simply being silent idols on pedestals. Their presence reshapes our understanding of the dynamics of courtly love and the agency of women within it. Number 8. It was a historical precursor to modern romantic love. When you think of romance today, you likely picture two people falling in love, building a life together, committing to each other, and possibly getting married. Our modern ideas of romantic love often emphasize mutual affection, companionship, fidelity within a marital relationship, and the pursuit of a shared future based on deep personal connection. Given how romantic courtly love sounds in popular culture, it is easy to assume that it was just an earlier version, a kind of foundational step. For the way we experience love today, however, this is a major misconception. Courtly love was a distinct cultural phenomenon born from the specific social, political, and economic conditions of the medieval aristocracy, and it possessed values and purposes that are fundamentally different from what we understand as modern romantic love. It was not simply a less developed version of our current ideals. It was a completely different beast. One of the most striking differences lies in the relationship between love and marriage. In medieval aristocratic society, marriage was primarily a practical institution. It was about alliances between powerful families, the transfer of land and wealth, the production of legitimate heirs, and the securing of political influence. Love, as we understand it, rarely had anything to do with it. Young noblemen and noblewomen were often betrothed. From childhood, their unions arranged by their parents or guardians to serve the family's interests. The idea of choosing one's spouse based on personal affection or shared feelings was largely absent from the aristocratic world. Marriages were a duty, a contract, a means of perpetuating a lineage and maintaining power. This is why many courtly love narratives feature a lady who is already married to someone else. Her marital status is not an obstacle to love, but often a precondition for it. The very excitement of courtly love often stemmed from its illicit nature, the thrilling transgression of societal norms and marital bonds. Contrast this with modern romantic love, where marriage is often seen as the ultimate expression and culmination of that love. For us, fidelity to one's spouse is typically a cornerstone of romantic relationships. Courtly love, however, often celebrated love outside of marriage, a clandestine affair that added spice and excitement to the otherwise utilitarian structure of medieval aristocratic life. The fidelity in courtly love was often to the illicit bond itself, not to a marriage partner. A knight might be utterly devoted and faithful to his chosen lady, but that lady would typically not be his wife, nor would he necessarily be expected to be faithful to his own wife if he were married. The love was often seen as something separate from the mundane, everyday reality of married life. Furthermore, courtly love was deeply intertwined with social status and performance. The elaborate rituals, the poetic expressions, the acts of chivalry, these were often displays designed to enhance the lover's reputation, prove his worth, and gain social advancement. A knight's pursuit of a high-ranking lady could elevate his own standing, even if the love was never consummated. It was a performance, a game played by the elite, with specific rules and expectations that had little to do with genuine emotional connection or shared values as we might define them today. The love was often a reflection of the lover's own idealized self-image and his desire for glory, rather than a focus on the lady's individual qualities or personality. The roots of modern romantic love, particularly as it relates to marriage and companionship, are often traced to different historical developments, such as the rise of Protestantism, changing economic structures, and the Enlightenment's emphasis on individual sentiment and happiness. While courtly love certainly contributed to the literary tradition of love and desire, it was a very specific form of love that was deeply embedded in the feudal system and the aristocratic culture of its time. It valued things like difficulty, secrecy, and suffering as proof of devotion, elements that are not central to our contemporary understanding of healthy, fulfilling romantic relationships. It was a product of its time, a fascinating historical packet, but not a direct, linear step towards the modern concepts of loving partnerships and marital bliss. Number 7. Knights were always noble and honorable in their pursuit of love. When you think of a medieval knight, images of gleaming armor, unwavering loyalty, and a spotless moral compass often come to mind. In the context of courtly love, this ideal is amplified, The knight is the epitome of chivalry, always acting with honor, selflessness, and pure devotion in his quest for his lady's favor. He performs heroic deeds, suffers silently, and always respects the lady's wishes, never stooping to anything less than the highest moral standards. This is a powerful image, and it is easy to believe that all knights involved in courtly love were paragons of virtue. However, this widely held belief is largely a misconception. The literary and historical records reveal a much more complex and often less than honorable reality. Knights, being human, were often driven by self-interest, ambition, and even outright manipulation in their pursuit of love. The service to the lady, a cornerstone of courtly love, was not always a purely selfless act. While it certainly involved elements of devotion, it could also be a strategic move designed to elevate the knight's own social standing or reputation. In a highly stratified medieval society, gaining the favor of a high-ranking noblewoman could open doors to patronage, wealth, and power. A knight's poetic declarations, his brave deeds on the battlefield or in tournaments, and his public displays of suffering for love were all ways to demonstrate his worth and potentially attract the attention of powerful patrons, male or female. The lady's favor, a scarf, a glove, a simple acknowledgement, was not just a token of affection, but a visible sign of her endorsement, which could translate into very real social and political advantages for the knight. The love could be a means to an end, a path to personal glory or material gain, rather than an end in itself. Consider the literary examples which often showcase the complexities and moral ambiguities of these characters. Lancelot, arguably the most famous knight in Arthurian legend, is the epitome of courtly devotion to Queen Guinevere. He performs countless heroic acts in her name. Yet his relationship with Guinevere is an illicit, adulterous affair, a betrayal of his king, Arthur, who is also his best friend and lord. Lancelot's immense bravery and chivalry are inextricably linked with his profound disloyalty to his sovereign. His pursuit of Guinevere leads to the downfall of the Round Table and the destruction of Arthur's kingdom. While he is portrayed as a tragic figure, his actions are far from purely honorable in a conventional sense. They are driven by an all-consuming passion that overrides his loyalty and duty. This demonstrates that honor in courtly love could be a very specific self-serving kind of honor, sometimes divorced from broader societal morality. Furthermore, some courtly love literature even explicitly describes manipulative or cunning strategies employed by the lover. Andreas Capellanus's D'amore, The Art of Courtly Love, written in the late 12th century, presents a fascinating and often disturbing rulebook for courtly relationships. While it is debated whether Capellanus intended his work as serious instruction or satire, it certainly outlines methods that are far from purely noble. He discusses different kinds of love and advises on how to win a lady's affection, sometimes suggesting approaches that involve deceit, flattery, or persistence bordering on harassment. For example, he details arguments that men can use to persuade women, some of which are quite cynical. He describes how to pursue love with women of different social classes, sometimes with very practical and less romantic advice. The very structure of D'amore suggests a strategic game, where the lover employs various tactics to achieve his desired outcome, rather than simply expressing pure, selfless devotion. Even in troubadour poetry, while many songs express sincere longing, some poems reveal a lover's self-obsession, his pride in his own suffering, or his frustration when his advances are not met. The emphasis could be on the lover's emotional state, his phenomenon, refined love, rather than a genuine concern for the lady's feelings or well-being. The honor of the knight in courtly love was often defined by his adherence to the specific, sometimes contradictory rules of the game of love itself, rather than a universal code of moral conduct that applied to all aspects of his life. The image of the consistently noble and honorable knight Pursuing love is therefore a romanticized ideal, and the reality was often far more nuanced and human. Number 6. It was a celebration of monogamous, faithful love. When we think of a love story, especially one that involves knights and ladies, our modern minds often default to the idea of two people committing solely to each other, forming a faithful monogamous bond ideally leading to a happy, lifelong union. It is easy to project our contemporary values of singular devotion onto historical concepts like courtly love. This leads to the common misconception that courtly love was a celebration of fidelity within a relationship, a kind of pre-modern endorsement of what we now call monogamy. However, this could not be further from the truth. In fact, one of the most defining characteristics of courtly love, and often its very essence, was its celebration of illicit relationships, often involving adultery, and a fundamental challenge to the institution of marriage as the locus of true love. In the medieval aristocratic world as discussed earlier, marriage was primarily a pragmatic social and economic contract. It was about securing alliances, consolidating power, and producing legitimate heirs. Personal affection or romantic love was rarely a factor in the arrangement of these unions. As a result, many noble marriages were devoid of emotional intimacy or passion. It was into this social landscape that courtly love emerged, often providing an emotional outlet, a space for idealized passion that was absent from the arranged marital bed. The object of the courtly lover's affection was almost invariably a married noblewoman, a dame, lady, of higher status, whose marital status was not a barrier, but often an essential element of the allure. The very thrill and heightened emotion of courtly love often stemmed from its clandestine nature, its inherent transgression of societal norms. The love was secret, dangerous, and therefore, in the minds of its proponents, more pure or refined than the mundane contractual obligations of marriage. The most iconic examples of courtly love relationships in literature vividly demonstrate this point. Consider the legendary tale of Tristan and Isolde. Their love is passionate, consuming, and tragic, but it is also profoundly illicit. Isolde is the wife of King Mark, Tristan's uncle and lord. Their love is driven by a magic potion, but it thrives in secrecy and constantly challenges the bonds of marriage, loyalty, and kinship. Their story is one of profound devotion, but it is devotion to each other outside of the bounds of marriage, leading to immense suffering and ultimately their deaths. Another quintessential example is the love between Sir Lancelot and Queen Guinevere. In the Arthurian legends, Guinevere is the wife of King Arthur, Lancelot's lord, and the very embodiment of righteous kingship. Their affair is the most famous example of courtly love in English literature, characterized by Lancelot's utter devotion and Guinevere's high status. Their deep affection for each other is idealized, often portrayed as noble and pure in its intensity. Yet, it is an adulterous relationship that ultimately leads to the fragmentation of the Round Table and the downfall of Arthur's kingdom. The fidelity that Lancelot shows is to Guinevere, not to his king or to his own moral duties as a knight. His faithfulness is directed solely towards his courtly lady, at the expense of all other loyalties. This demonstrates that the concept of fidelity in courtly love was often narrowly defined as loyalty to the chosen lover, regardless of other existing commitments, particularly marital ones. The influential medieval text, D'amore, The Art of Courtly Love, by Andreas Capellanus, explicitly states that true love can have no place between husband and wife. While interpretations of Capellanus's work vary, some argue it is satirical, others a serious exploration, this widely cited maxim betues the prevalent idea that marriage and love were distinct and often mutually exclusive categories. In the aristocratic imagination, marriage was seen as a social obligation, while love was an intoxicating, often dangerous pursuit that blossomed in secrecy and defied conventional bonds. The very notion of femme amour, or refined love, central to the troubadour tradition, emphasized the suffering and difficulty of the illicit affair, contrasting it with the perceived lack of passion and emotional depth in arranged marriages. Therefore, courtly love, far from celebrating monogamous marital fidelity, often glorified the very opposite, a passionate, secretive, and frequently adulterous love that challenged the sanctity of marriage. Number 5. It was purely romantic and beautiful. When people imagine courtly love, they often conjure up images of poetic beauty, idealized devotion, and a deep, almost spiritual connection between a knight and his lady. The language used to describe it in literature often speaks of suffering for love, acts of chivalry, and the elevation of the soul, all of which contribute to a perception of it as a purely beautiful and noble pursuit. This common perception leads to the misconception that courtly love was simply a form of elevated romance, always graceful and ultimately harmless. However, beneath the polished verses and heroic deeds, courtly love could be a deeply dangerous, destructive, and even violent phenomenon. It was not always charming. It carried significant risks for all involved, leading to scandal, social ruin, and sometimes even death. The very nature of courtly love, often being an illicit affair between a knight and a married noblewoman, made it inherently perilous. Discovery meant, potentially, catastrophic consequences. A jealous husband, humiliated by his wife's perceived infidelity, could resort to extreme measures. In medieval society, a husband's honor was inextricably linked to his wife's fidelity. Public knowledge of an affair could lead to duels, feuds between noble families, or even brutal punishments for the lovers. While literary narratives often romanticized the secrecy, the reality of a clandestine relationship in a tightly controlled aristocratic court was fraught with danger. Whispers, spies, and accidental disclosures were constant threats. The stakes were incredibly high. Consider the legends and real-life historical accounts, which often underscore these dangers. The story of Paolo and Francesca, immortalized in Dante Alighieri's Inferno, is a tragic example. Francesca, the Rimini, a noblewoman, and Paolo Malatesta, her brother-in-law, fall in love while reading the story of Lancelot and Guinevere. Their affair is discovered by Francesca's husband, Gianciotto Malatesta, who in a furious rage murders them both. This tale, whether entirely factual or embellished, reflects the very real and brutal consequences of illicit love in medieval Italy. The beauty of their shared reading and their burgeoning affection ends in swift, violent death, far from any romantic ideal. Furthermore, the intensity of emotion associated with courtly love, while beautiful in poetry, could be personally destructive. The lover's suffering, a key component of courtly love, was not always a poetic metaphor for devotion. It could be genuine anguish, obsession, and emotional torment. The constant pining, the unfulfilled desire, the emotional highs and lows, and the need for secrecy could take a severe toll on the psychological well-being of the individuals involved. The literary tradition often glorifies this suffering as proof of the lover's genuine feeling. But in a real-world context, it would have been agonizing. The inability to openly express love, the fear of exposure, and the constant emotional limbo could lead to despair. Scandal and social ruin were also very real threats. A noblewoman whose affair became public knowledge could face severe repercussions, including banishment from court, disinheritance, or being forced into a convent. Her reputation, crucial for her family's standing, could be irrevocably tarnished. Similarly, a knight found to be engaged in an illicit relationship could lose his position, his patronage, or even his life. The game of courtly love, while performed with elaborate rituals and poetic language, was not without its very serious, often brutal, real-world consequences. The idealized vision of courtly love, as purely beautiful and noble, ignores the darker, more dangerous undercurrents that were inherent to its practice in medieval aristocratic society. It was a high-stakes endeavor, beautiful in its literary expression, but potentially devastating in its reality. Number 4. The lady was always a passive, distant object of adoration. When courtly love is depicted, especially in popular media, the lady often appears as a remote ethereal figure, perched in a tower or on a high throne, an untouchable ideal. She is the recipient of the knight's adoration, the muse for his poems, and the inspiration for his heroic deeds. She remains distant, perhaps bestowing a scarf or a favor, but otherwise seemingly passive, simply existing as the object of his intense gaze and unwavering devotion. This portrayal paints a picture of a medieval woman with little agency or active role in the courtly love dynamic, reducing her to a beautiful static symbol. However, this is a significant misconception. Noble ladies in the Middle Ages, especially those of high rank, held considerable power and influence, and they were far from passive participants in the intricate dance of courtly love. They could be active, influential figures, sometimes even initiators, and their approval was not a given, but a powerful decision. In feudal society, noble women, particularly those who were wives or mothers of lords, often held significant authority. They managed vast estates in the absence of their husbands, oversaw household affairs, administered justice, and even defended castles during wartime. Figures like Eleanor of Aquitaine, already mentioned, are prime examples of women who exercised immense political and cultural power. They held their own courts, where poets and knights gathered, and they were discerning patrons who cultivated artistic expression. This real-world power translated into their roles within the courtly love framework. The lady's favor was not a trivial gesture. It was a manifestation of her social power and her ability to elevate or diminish a suitor. The lady's position as damna, lady or mistress, in Occitan troubadour poetry, for example, often implied a feudal relationship where the lover was her vassal, performing service to her as a knight would to his lord. This relationship inverted the typical power dynamics of medieval society, where men generally held overt authority over women. In the courtly love context, the lady was typically of higher social status or perceived moral superiority than her suitor, giving her immense power over his aspirations and emotional state. She was the one who could grant or deny the mercy or favor that the lover so desperately sought. Her smile, her glance, her acceptance of a poetic tribute, or her bestowal of a token, like a sleeve or a scarf, were potent signs of approval. Conversely, her rejection, scorn, or indifference could plunge the lover into profound despair. A common theme in courtly poetry. Moreover, ladies were not merely passive recipients of adoration. They could actively set conditions, test the lover's devotion, and even initiate or reciprocate interest. Tests of the lover's sincerity and perseverance were often dictated by the lady. She might demand years of patient service, acts of bravery, or strict adherence to secrecy before granting any form of favor. In some narratives, the lady takes an active role in shaping the relationship, guiding the knight, or even expressing her own desires. For example, in some of the lays of Marie de France, particularly L'Envol, the fairy mistress is the one who chooses and bestows gifts upon the knight, setting the terms of their relationship. In other troubadour poems, the trobairitz, female troubadours, directly express their agency and desires, sometimes even criticizing their male lovers for lack of attention or fidelity, clearly demonstrating that women were not silent recipients but vocal participants. The lady's power was also rooted in the concept of honor and reputation. Her acceptance of a suitor, even if only in a poetic or symbolic sense, bestowed honor upon him. Her careful management of her reputation was essential, especially in the context of potentially illicit love. She was not a doll on a shelf. She had to skillfully navigate the social landscape, balancing her desires with the need to maintain her dignity and avoid scandal. This required intelligence, discretion, and a keen understanding of courtly politics. Therefore, the image of the passive, distant lady is a simplistic one. Courtly lady was a powerful figure, possessing agency, influence, and the critical ability to shape the entire dynamic of the courtly love relationship, whether through her favor, her rejection, or her active participation. Number 3. It was a real, standardized code of conduct, followed by everyone. Many people imagine courtly love as a universally understood and strictly followed set of rules, almost like a medieval etiquette handbook for romance. You might picture courts of love where actual cases of romantic disputes were heard, and definitive judgments were handed down based on a shared code of conduct. This idea suggests a rigid, standardized system that governed romantic interactions across medieval society, a sort of medieval legal framework for illicit passion. However, this is a significant misconception. Courtly love was primarily a literary genre, a set of themes and conventions explored in poetry and romance, rather than a codified social practice uniformly applied by everyone. It was much more fluid, varied, and often contradictory than a strict rulebook. Concept of courts of love, for example, which appear in some medieval texts, are almost certainly literary fictions rather than actual historical judicial bodies. The most famous mention comes from Andreas Capellanus's De Amore, The Art of Courtly Love, written in the late 12th century. Capellanus describes various judgments made by aristocratic ladies, including Eleanor of Aquitaine and her daughter Marie de Champagne, on complex love cases. However, these descriptions are embedded within a text that is itself highly ambiguous, possibly satirical, and certainly not a record of actual legal proceedings. Scholars widely agree that these courts were likely intellectual games or literary devices used to explore philosophical questions about love, rather than real institutions that enforced rules on the medieval nobility. There is no independent historical evidence of such courts genuinely functioning as legal entities. Furthermore, the rules of courtly love were never truly standardized or agreed upon across different regions, time periods, or authors. What one troubadour might emphasize, another might ignore or even contradict. The themes of courtly love appeared in diverse literary forms. The cansos of the Occitan troubadours, the lays of Marie de France, the Arthurian romances of Chrétien de Troyes, and later works like the Roman de la Rose. Each of these traditions, and indeed each individual author, brought their own interpretations and nuances to the concept. For instance, the troubadours often focused on the intense emotional suffering and devotion of the lover, while Chrétien de Troyes explored the tension between courtly love and chivalric duty, often leading to conflicts for his knightly protagonists. The ideas about secrecy, consummation, and the role of marriage varied greatly. Andreas Capellanus's De Amore is often seen as the closest thing to a rule book for courtly love. He famously lists rules like, "Marriage is no excuse for not loving. No one can be bound by two loves, and love is always a stranger in the home of avarice." While this text attempts to systematize the principles of courtly love, it is important to remember that De Amore itself was controversial and debated in its own time. Its exact purpose is still a subject of scholarly discussion. Was it a serious guide for lovers, a satirical critique of the genre, or an academic exercise? Regardless, it was certainly not universally accepted as a definitive legal or social code that dictated everyone's behavior. Many medieval authors and thinkers directly challenged or ignored Capellanus's pronouncements. The reality is that courtly love was a complex and evolving set of literary conventions and social ideals, not a rigid, uniformly applied code of conduct. It provided a framework for artistic expression, a way to explore themes of desire, loyalty, suffering, and social hierarchy within the aristocratic world. Different poets and patrons adapted these conventions to their own contexts and artistic visions. There was no central authority enforcing these rules, and there was no widespread social agreement on their precise meaning or application. To view courtly love as a standardized code that governed the lives of all medieval aristocrats is to misunderstand its fluid and predominantly literary nature. It was a rich and varied tapestry of ideas, constantly being reinterpreted and challenged by its very creators. Number 2, it was a widespread practice across all social classes. When people encounter the concept of courtly love, they might assume it was a pervasive aspect of medieval life, something that everyone, from the lowliest peasant to the highest noble, understood and participated in. Tales of knights and ladies often feel so universal that it is easy to imagine these romantic ideals permeating every corner of society. This leads to the misconception that courtly love was a widespread practice, influencing the romantic lives of people from all social classes. However, this is far from the truth. Courtly love was overwhelmingly an aristocratic phenomenon, a literary and social convention primarily confined to the elite educated circles of the medieval courts and castles. The very nature of courtly love made it inaccessible to the vast majority of the medieval population. It required specific conditions that were the exclusive preserve of the nobility: leisure time, education, and a sophisticated courtly environment. Firstly, leisure time was a luxury most medieval people simply did not possess. The vast majority of the population were peasants, tied to the land, working from dawn to dusk to produce food and survive. Their lives were consumed by manual labor, agricultural cycles, and the immediate necessities of daily existence. They had little time, energy, or opportunity for elaborate poetic declarations, clandestine meetings, or intricate games of romantic devotion. Their relationships, often leading to marriage, were typically practical unions, focused on economic cooperation and procreation. Secondly, courtly love was deeply intertwined with literacy and sophisticated literary culture. It was expressed through complex poetry, allegorical narratives, and philosophical discussions about the nature of love. Reading, writing, and appreciating such works required a level of education that was primarily found within the church and among the aristocracy. Troubadours, quadrines, and authors of romances who created and disseminated courtly love literature were patronized by wealthy nobles, and their audiences were typically other nobles who understood the literary conventions and courtly etiquette. Peasants were largely illiterate and had no access to these texts or the leisure time to engage with them. Their cultural expressions of love would have been found in folk songs, local customs, and oral traditions, which differed significantly from the refined, intricate world of courtly love. Thirdly, courtly love was specifically tied to the social structures of the medieval court. It revolved around the relationships between knights, noble women, and their lords and ladies within the confines of a feudal household or royal court. These were places of sophisticated social interaction where reputation, status, and intricate hierarchies were constantly at play. The game of courtly love often served as a way for knights to elevate their standing, gain patronage, and demonstrate their refinement within this specific environment. It was a performance for an elite audience, understood by those who lived within these specific social circles. Merchants, artisans, and other urban dwellers, while perhaps having more leisure than peasants, operated within different social structures and engaged in different forms of social interaction, with little to no connection to the aristocratic courtly love complex. While some themes from courtly love literature might have trickled down to a wider audience in simplified forms over time, the sophisticated concept of fineamor, or the specific rituals and values of courtly love, were fundamentally aristocratic. It was an elite entertainment, a pastime, and a form of cultural expression for those who had the wealth, status, and education to participate. It shaped the ideals of love and behavior within this specific social stratum, but had little direct bearing on the daily lives or romantic customs of the vast majority of people in medieval Europe. The idea that a peasant boy would pursue a peasant girl with the same elaborate poetic declarations and self-sacrificing devotion as a knight for his lady is a romanticized notion that ignores the stark social realities of the Middle Ages. Number 1. It was always about unconsummated, platonic love. This is perhaps the biggest and most persistent misconception about courtly love. Image of the knight pining from afar, forever suffering for a lady he can never truly touch, often leads people to believe that courtly love was an entirely spiritual, non-physical, or purely platonic affection. The idea is that it was about elevating the soul, purifying desire, and never, ever about physical intimacy. You might hear terms like spiritual love or pure love applied to it, suggesting an absolute absence of sexual desire or contact. However, this is a profound misunderstanding of the multifaceted nature of courtly love. While it often involved idealization and a strong emphasis on the suffering of the lover, many poems and romances depict intense physical desire and even actual sexual encounters, often within the specific, illicit boundaries of the relationship. Courtly love was far from exclusively platonic. It was frequently highly sexual, even if illicit, and sometimes led to consummation. The very term phenomer, refined love, which was used by the troubadours of Aquitania, does not necessarily imply an absence of physicality. Instead, it suggests a love that is perfected through suffering, discretion, and the cultivation of refined emotions. This refinement did not automatically exclude physical intimacy. In many troubadour poems, while the poet might lament his suffering and the lady's distance, the underlying desire is clearly physical. The reward or mercy, that the lover seeks from his lady often includes physical affection, ranging from a kiss to more intimate acts. The language of these poems can be highly suggestive, hinting at the culmination of physical desire, even if not always explicitly stating it. The ambiguity itself was often part of the allure, creating a space for both idealized longing and tantalizing anticipation. Consider the grades of love discussed in Andreas Capellanus's De Memor. Capellanus outlines different levels of intimacy that a lover might achieve with his lady. He begins with the giving of hope, progresses to the giving of a kiss, then the giving of an embrace, and finally the giving of the whole person, or the final solace. While Capellanus warns against the dangers of mixed love, physical love, in his later, more moralizing sections, his very detailed description of these steps makes it clear that physical consummation was a recognized and often desired outcome within the framework of courtly love. His instructions on how to achieve these various levels of intimacy demonstrate that the goal was often explicitly or implicitly physical union, albeit under strict conditions of secrecy and discretion. Furthermore, many of the most popular and influential courtly romances vividly depict sexual encounters. The Lais of Marie de France, written in the late 12th century, frequently feature consummation as a central element of the narrative. For instance, in her Lie Lanval, the knight Lanval falls in love with a mysterious fairy mistress. Their love is passionate and physical, and their relationship is clearly consummated. Tragedy arises not from the absence of physical love, but from the violation of a specific condition set by the fairy lady. In Yonick, a lady trapped in a loveless marriage finds love with a knight who visits her in the form of a bird. Their love is also physical and leads to pregnancy. These stories show that physical love, far from being absent, was often integral to the courtly narratives, serving as a powerful expression of the emotional bond and the passionate desire. Even in the most famous example, the love between Lancelot and Guinevere, while deeply idealized and often portrayed with great suffering, their relationship is undeniably physical. Their affair is a central plot point in the Arthurian romances, and their physical intimacy is not just implied but sometimes directly described or alluded to as the tragic cause of their downfall. Tension and emotional depth of their story derive precisely from the powerful, forbidden nature of their physical and emotional bond. Therefore, while courtly love certainly emphasizes elements like discretion, idealized suffering, and the pursuit of a sometimes unattainable ideal, it was by no means exclusively Platonic. Physical desire and consummation were often inherent parts of the dynamic, making the notion of a purely spiritual, non-physical, courtly love a significant oversimplification and a persistent misconception.